basically what I want to do is go through a little bit. I mean, 100 years is a lot to go through. The good news is we have really good records for the beginnings of bank, like from the very beginning up till the mid-40s, even through the 50s. After that, not as good, but we still have a lot. So when I started looking into this, Lois had put together a scrapbook that was fabulous, and it's here, and it lives at the sanctuary, and if you are out there sometime, just go through it page by page. It's fabulous. And how some of those pictures survived the big fire, who a lot of you know about, some of you may not. I don't know, but they did. So that's one major source of information. Another major source of information, of photos, was from the grandmother of the people who I introduced at this table, whose name was Amelia Heidweiler. And Amelia kept, you know how we all keep photos? Well, photos are useful up to a point. But when every single photo is put in an album with the date and the place, and everybody in the photo is labeled, then it's really valuable. Because I can't tell you how many photos you look at and you say, who are those people? Where was that? When was that? And Amelia was amazing in so many ways. And she did that. How did I find this out? Thanks to her granddaughter, and her grandson, I'm sure, was involved. But I called Carol out of the blue last fall. She almost hung up thinking who is this guy? And I got past the point where I wasn't selling anything. And she ended up donating to Bank her grandmother's incredible scrapbook of photos, like I just described, going way back. And it's just fabulous. And their grandmother did these, I know you can't see, but these are these beautiful notebooks. I think they came from Scranton's back in the 20s, handwritten in beautiful cursive script, and kept, you would not believe, detailed records of every meeting, every field trip, what they saw, what species, you name it, in incredible detail. So we have, somehow again, surviving the fire, I don't know how, we have from 1929 to 1945. Incredible. These books are so valuable. So we have those. We did have in our files these, what do we call them, annual booklets for every year, starting in 1923. We have a complete set. I think we're maybe missing one in the 80s. But from 1923, which was the first one, we have a complete set. So they list every program, every committee, every field trip, and then I have, and I'll show you, in Amelia's handwriting, and some others too, well, we saw, what birds we saw, what plants we saw on that field trip, how many people were there. I mean, it's like a treasure. So haven't done as much botany as I'd like to be doing this year, but I've gotten really interested in this history. So anyway, let me tell you a little bit about, anybody recognize that building? Yeah. Maybe a few of you a little bit, because even the clubhouse you knew didn't look like that, but this was the farm that was bought in 1927. Okay? And I just want to point your attention, this tree. This tree, I guess I'm looking at it reversed on the screen. So it's that tree there. Does anybody recognize that tree? The one in the front? That is, I'm pretty sure that is the only tree that goes back to when the farm was actually moved in by the people who sold it to Bank in 1836. That's the shagbark hickory, I'm pretty sure. That's the only remaining tree that I can tell that's still part of the sanctuary. Anyway. So I'm going to start before Bank and tell you a little bit about this property, this land, before it was Bank. And this is, oh, I see the problem. Oh well, it's too late. I'm going to have to wing it from my head. This photo was taken around 1870 from the top of the hill across the road. Okay, so we're looking down. That's that old farmhouse I just showed you a picture of with the fence. And you see the creek? Big meanders. That's our creek. That's Irondequoit Creek with those big meanders as it looked in 1870. You see the Auburn Railroad tracks? The road wasn't there, but you could see that straight line cut into the hillside. That was where the railroad went. You see how it's a farm. It's fields. There were some woods on the slopes. That was it. Man, this is a priceless photo. It was taken by somebody named Miles Cutting, who was a station master. I'll show you the picture of the little train stop. And there was a post office. He was a postmaster. He had owned some mills. And he was a really good photographer. So this was the property. Long before Bank even was thought of. It was a farm. And this lady, Miranda, anybody in this room ever met her? She died in 1979. She was born on that farm in 1876. And there she is at Bank, and it was her 90th birthday. She died 2 years later. Her father moved to that farm with his father, so with her grandfather, when her father was a couple of months old in 1836. The building still existed. So we have this amazing history. It was in one family all that time that loved the property. They ended up buying more land. They owned more land than the little 30 acres that's Bank. They farmed other parts of the property. But Miranda grew up there. She went to school in the little farmhouse at the end of the road there. Some of you know it. Heading the other way on Railroad Mills past the Auburn Trail to that T. There's a little schoolhouse there. Anyway, Miranda was a really interesting person. I'll tell you a little more. She wrote, I don't know if you can read, so I'll read it to you. She wrote a little booklet, like several pages, in 1935. So it was sold in 1927. She was happy that a nature-loving group bought it, and she says, my family were all nature lovers, so the fact that their home is now a clubhouse for other nature lovers makes a fitting memorial to them. In 1971, Reg Hartwell sat down with Miranda. He corresponded with her. She was still in the area. And they wrote this book called Slab Hollow Farm. Before it was called Railroad Mills, it was called Slab Hollow. And it's a great story of that time. And there's Reg, and some of you will remember him. He was a really sweet guy. And Reg is talking at the 1977, so that would have been the 50th anniversary of the farm, of buying the farm. Okay, and Reg was really into the history. Reg was a former president in the late 50s, involved from the 50s till he died in the late 80s, and a ton of stuff. I have a whole tape that I digitized of him giving a history program. Plus he was interested in everything. He was great to be out in the field. He was curious about everything. So he did this map. I don't know who did this map. But what I want you to see here is, get you oriented. Okay, let's see. So here's the clubhouse. That's what they call the house. The old road, not the new road. The old road went down what's Audubon Lane. There was a big barn. There were orchards. Remember, this was all open. pasture, even the wetland was pasture. The only thing that was woods were on the hills. The one hill to the east. The rest was all open. It was orchards, pasture. So the old road went by the barn and then turned down what they call Keller Lane. This was Audubon Lane, Keller Lane by Keller Knoll, which is here. And there was no bridge right at that oxbow. So anyway, you can see old, where that barn was. So I'll just show you a few old pictures. This was a 1902 spring snowstorm, and that was a Woolston. And here you can see, there's the house. This was the barn that's obviously no longer there. There were some outbuildings. This is all on our property. It's hard to picture now when there's woods, but that's what it was. That was Miranda's father and a friend in front of the house around 1875. And then Reg did this. I love it. I mean, he was so into it. The house was built in 1816, just the first part on this side. Just, and then they added on, like they did in these old farmhouses. They added on a few times. They built this whole wing right after the Civil War. Anyway, can only scratch the surface tonight. I love this picture because this shows this tree, which for people who grew up, who were part of early bank, it was like the black maple. They always talked about the black maple. And in the 1880s, it was like 50 years old. Miranda said it was it and the hickory, the only trees there. This lasted till around 1950. But you see, there was wood, there was a well, there was no porch, there were beehives. They heated with 6 chimneys. Doesn't this look like pioneers? This was 2 years before Miranda was born. This was 1884. This baby died 2 years later. That was her father. That was her mother. That was her aunt who became her aunt, married her uncle, I guess. And that was the grandfather. There he is reading his Bible, she says, who died a few years later. He's who moved there in 1836. So you get this feeling. I mean, they were way out. These were homesteaders, right? Notice, I'm not doing this for notes. Notice these rocks. These were all cobblestones from 9 Mile Point, Avalon Lake, Ontario. Yeah. And a friend of mine, Carl Hergersel, lives in a house on Fisher's Road. That's another farmhouse right around that time. And he's got stones just like that. I bet they came from the same place. That's where they got them at that time. Anyway, that's her grandfather sawing wood a year before he died. Apparently he was strong and could do lots of stuff right until the end. Spring flood. You can see all the smoke coming out the chimneys. This was early 1900s. Miranda talks about being at the, never mind. Look at, and that's our farm, the barn and the house, and these buildings are all gone, but there were all these mills. It was called railroad mills. And what's left of it is just the one farmhouse across the street that used to have lots of mills, and I'll show you. But look at this. This was the whistle stop, right? This is where it was called railroad mills. In fact, it was a post office. Look at that. I was so excited to find that. That's 1903, the railroad mills postmark. Okay? And that guy, John Leeper, is the guy who bought the farm from the Woolstons in 1925. He couldn't pay the mortgage. He sold it a year later to a bank. Okay?
Is this the little yellow railroad house?
No, this house is no longer here. But take a close look at this picture and you'll see exactly where it was. Okay? Yeah, I took this because this is my big battle a lot of you know about. Sad battle with the Auburn Trail. But look at that curve. I mean, that's it. It was right there at the corner. Okay? Okay, so, anyway, there was this big stuff going on. In the 1800s, 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, mills of all sorts, flour mills, sawmill, not powder mill here, but I got this from the Victor Historical Society, and then from Sheldon Fisher must have identified them. I found a newspaper article, so I put on these numbers, and you can see. But this was a big mill pond. Now there's a smaller version of it there. It was a lot bigger, with the only thing that's in this picture that's still there is number 2, is this house, where Kumatat lives. The rest of the buildings are gone. There were fires, but this was railroad mills back then. And that's an outing on the mill pond. I couldn't believe that picture. So they just diverted around Around Creek to run these mills. Okay? So that's a little background about the property. Now let's get to Burroughs. Okay. So Hoot and Burroughs, the birthing of our club. Well, John Burroughs, as Julie mentioned, and some of you know, I read him years ago. He was a famous nature writer in the 19th century into the early 20th century who wrote volumes and good writing. And he influenced lots of people. He influenced Teddy Roosevelt, who, by the way, Miranda said she saw when he was going down the trains once. But I love this picture, looking at a ruined anemone. He started out as a bureaucrat. He couldn't hack it. He found out he had a talent for writing. He was encouraged by people like Walt Whitman and went on to this, very impressive and influential career. So very well known, and people bought his books. So here he is. There's a couple more images of him. You get the sense of when he lived. He lived in the Catskills. Some of you may have been there. Banks been there twice. 1926 and 1971. Some people went down there. I understand. But anyway, for sure in 1926, we've got great records of that. They went to Woodchuck Lodge and slab sites. So, these books, I took these pictures of these books. We have a complete set in the sanctuary. And there's a lot of volumes. Look at them all. Okay? So, if it was 1913, Burroughs hadn't written everything, but he'd written about 17 or 18. If you were one of the people who had purchased these, you became a member of the Burroughs Nature Club. It was a little come-on by the publisher, and they sent you some questions to see how well you learned the material. It's just 10 questions. And if you answered them right, you got some kind of prize. So, Hoot, who grew up in Sodus, found out about this, and he wrote to the publisher, and he got the names of the people in the Rochester area who got these prizes, who bought it and got the right questions. And he said, I hear, Florence Mosher, you're a charter member of the Burroughs Nature Club. See, it's dated June 2nd, 1913. Florence sent the original one of this to Bank in the 80s, and thank goodness we have it. Okay? Florence was moving out of Rochester, probably clearing out her stuff. Anyway, so who wrote to these people and said, would you like to start a club? Let's have a meeting. So they had 1 or 2 meetings, and I think it was June 26th, 1913. This guy. Here he is, William Hoot. They got together, and something, I can't tell exactly how many for sure, because I have different lists of charter members, but the names aren't exactly the same on the lists. So around 37 or 40, I don't know. Something like that. And this is what Hoot says in his history. Thus began a club that was destined to play an important part in the study of nature and protection of birds and wildlife in Rochester and vicinity. Which is true. And he says the club became a factor in national affairs, which is true also. And I'll give you some examples of that. So it was pretty significant. Think of the time, 1913. Audubon Society had just formed a few years before, and that formed when they were shooting those beautiful egrets for the feathers and the women's, caps, and slaughtering birds. Passenger pigeons were essentially extinct. There was still one left in the zoo, died the last year, but essentially extinct by then. So there was some awareness of what was going on about to species and to habitats. So it was the perfect time. So, this is where they had that meeting, in the old Reynolds Library. Yesterday's paper, Mehmet, I think his name is, wrote about Abelard Reynolds. I need you, Dean. Anyway, this was the old Reynolds Library where they met. And in the early years, they were sometimes held in the old RIT called the Mechanics Institute. We're talking the teens. Fairchild, fabulous, well-known geologist at the U of R, gave a program in the first year, became a member. So they had lots of really amazing people, I think, in those times. The Rochester Museum celebrated its 100th anniversary last year, because this is where they met, in the Edgerton Park, which is on the west side of the city. It's called Exposition Park back then. And that's where we had some meetings there as well. In fact, in 1922, they invited Bank to have a nature room and to have all of their meetings there from 1922 on. There was a very close collaboration between the museum and Bank for decades, really until the 70s. It was a very good relationship. So anyway, they had that meeting, and Hoot, meanwhile, he's corresponding with Burroughs and gets an invitation to visit him. So Hoot, later that year, goes down to Woodchuck Lodge, spends one night, and it's all in the secretary minutes because he came back and gave a program about it. The day he was there, Thomas Edison came and visited Burroughs. Hoot wasn't all that impressed. But anyway, that was that. Then they invited Burroughs to come to a bank. And the DNC puts it in their paper, Hoot Nature Club to hear Burroughs by the end of the year. Well, they were a little off. It wasn't next year, but it's pretty close. So Hoot came, and this was a hoot, because he didn't know exactly when he was coming. And he gets this telegram, and it says, I'm on my way. I'll be at the railroad station like at 10:30. He gets this telegram like at 9 o'clock, something like that. So Hoot gets in his car, picks him up, and he takes him to his summer place. A lot of these people who had a place in the city, and then he had a summer place up by Durant. And here's this map that shows this is Hoot's place, and it says W.B. Hoot. I think that was his initial right there, right next to a Y camp. I think Hoot called it Natop. So not only did he pick him up, he told his wife, Burroughs is coming. And his wife, she was really cool, according to the secretary minutes. So she made pie plant for lunch. Anybody know what pie plant is? What? Yeah, exactly. Rhubarb. So they made rhubarb pie for lunch. And then they called the secretary. How did they notify people? This was before email, a few years. He was there for one day. Meanwhile, they made these phone calls, I guess, and people made their way a long way up. This is, right along the lake, just by Durand. You may recognize Tamarack Swamp. Anyway, and they went up there that afternoon. And this is the most amazing picture ever. Because, let me go back and tell you a little more. So, you see there's a Y camp right here, and then there's a ravine. Well, firstly, he says in the notes, while we were there, the girls at the Y camp gave the Chautauqua salute. Anybody? The Chautauqua salute. It's a daintily waving of white handkerchiefs. How do I know? Google it. It came from Chautauqua. When there was a deaf person mining in the 1870s, and that's what people did to show their appreciation. Amazing what you learn. So anyway, so that happened, and all the people from Bank came, and there was this great quote. Oh, I'm so sorry I don't have my notes, but something like, Mrs. Hoot acted like it was like, you couldn't even tell that 100 people were going to descend on her. Well, in fact, they had 50, and then Hoot had, this was before, remember, before Sanctuary, Hoot had talked to his neighbors, and got like 6 neighbors to say, let's dedicate a bird sanctuary right there. So what did that mean? It meant Bank was able to put up posted signs of some sort saying, this is a bird sanctuary. And the neighbors all agreed, and here they are following Hoot and Burroughs there, and they're going to dedicate this bird sanctuary. I mean, I just think it's fabulous. Look what they're wearing. So, and I love this quote. This is from the Minutes about Burroughs. Members expected a man more spare in figure, instead of built on rather large lines and with an inclination toward rotundity. Not altogether an enemy of good food. But he was so alert of ear, mind, as to be able to meet these members of our club and distinguish the speakers as they bombarded him with questions. Can't you imagine? So they went down there. I don't know if they planted a tree or what, but there was a shovel, and Burroughs inscribed the shovel and gave it to Hoot as a gift. And there's the shovel. In 1972, when we had a visit from his granddaughter, Elizabeth Burroughs Kelly. And there's Reg, and there's Ione, and I guess Ione's, some of her kids are here. I haven't met you yet. That's Hoot's granddaughter. His name was Smith, I think. Jones, George Jones. And that's Elizabeth Slater. And I believe, according to my notes, to the thing, that this woman is Sarah Cheeseman, who Reg learned was one of the girls who gave that salute. She died at age 97, like in 1981. Isn't that amazing? Okay. So, remember, we didn't have the sanctuary till 27, so what was it like in those days before a sanctuary? Well, Hoot tells us because he wrote a history. And it's right here. I brought the book, but here you see it. First 17 years of Bank, 1913 to 1930, is full of great information. But remember, when we started, we were the Burroughs Nature Club. Remember, it wasn't Burroughs Audubon, and a lot of people wonder, what is this Audubon about? Well, the Burroughs Nature Club, remember, it was about these people who bought these books. And in 1914, the president of the Burroughs Nature Club nationally came and gave a program that was well attended. And the way Hoot tells the story was, at the end of the program, Hoot told people, if you like this and you're interested in nature, join our club. And then this guy, I forget his name, but it'll appear, told Hoot later, he said, oh, you forgot to tell them they have to buy the books. And Hoot was outraged. He said, I don't care about your books. This is not making money for a publisher. It's about people interested in nature. So this is how Hoot tells it. Hoot had to have been quite a character. Mr. Pratt was politely informed that we are an independent organization for the study of nature and that no special set of books or periodicals was necessary. Furthermore, we were not a book agency and never would be. So there. And not only that, after that, he said, what is this about Burroughs? Anyway, it's a publisher. We should be part of Audubon. So he found out the next year and made a motion, and here it is. If you add Audubon to your name and you pay $5 dues, you're a member of the Audubon. Doesn't work today, but that's what it was then. And that is why we are Burroughs Audubon. Okay. So, this woman here is the grandmother of these people at this table. And this is Amelia in her photo in 1924, our very devoted secretary who was absolutely incredible in so many ways. And it's because of many people, but for my purposes, I couldn't have done this without the incredible amount of material from her, both written and photographic. So we don't have all her minutes, but we have her 1924 minutes that were typed, and we're missing from the middle of 25 to 29. Sadly, we don't get the dedication of the sanctuary. But then we got all these books I held up before from 1929 to 1945, and she was secretary until 1942. Who asked her, because our current secretary in 23 was moving to California, and who'd said, Amelia, as I have read it from her, could you fill in? And so it sounded temporary, and you know how that is 19 years later, and involving her whole family. So those are the books. That's the handwriting. And that, plus all these fabulous annual booklets that I was telling you about, is where a lot of this information came from. So who were some of these people in those days before we had a sanctuary? One of these was this guy named Clinton Kellogg. He was a founder. He was one of the founders. He was a school principal in Rochester and was a fabulous photographer. So he did this program, Nature Glimpses and Nature Colors. Unfortunately, I don't have it in color. But he gave it around, and he gave it to Bank, went out to Buffalo, and gave it to their Audubon Society. Really impressive guy. And look at these photos. These are lantern slides that he took. And I just took pictures of the lantern slides, but just so you get a sense. And some of the stuff isn't even common. Like red-headed woodpecker are not common now in Rochester. Certainly golden-winged warblers. Here there's eating out of chicks in somebody's hand. I don't know if you can see that. Red crossbill. Fabulous photos. I mean, this guy was pretty talented, but he didn't just do birds. He did flowers. He did bugs. Look at these moths. These are moths. And a lot of you know I've done programs on moths. I've set out my light. I've never gotten an Io moth in Rochester. I've gotten them at lots of other places, but never. So you see how things have changed. The hickory horned devil is almost gone from New York State. And yet it must have been common enough that he photographed it in Rochester. Anyway, pretty talented people. One more thing about Clinton Kellogg. Who was president for 17 years, I told you, 1913 to 1930. However, after 1913, we had 150 members. Amazing. And then World War I. We went through a couple of wars, right? World War I, things really dropped off. By 1917, 1918, we were down to 57. Things were pretty slow. In 1919, Hood wanted a break. He asked Kellogg if he would be president. Kellogg said, okay. And then as Hood tells it, there was no meeting. Nothing happened for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. Finally, he gets a letter from Kellogg saying, well, I'm too busy. I really can't do this job. So Hood went back to being president, 1919. So Hood, I think he was a very strong personality, which is okay. You got things done. He had a vision. And his vision was protection of nature and education, teaching other people. So he wrote to Arthur Allen, who a lot of you may know, some of you may know, founded the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Very well-known ornithologist at Cornell. And I've highlighted here, our club proposes to do some missionary work, the object of which is to get children in our rural schools interested in the study of our native birds. And rural schools, that could be Greece, Irondequoit, it was all rural, really. Okay. And Allen actually declined the offer because he said, well, really what you're asking for, they made too many mistakes in that publication. But it started a relationship with Allen that spanned decades. And he came and gave several programs. Here he is in 1957 when Bank made a trip to the Lab of Ornithology. And some of you might recognize some of the people in the picture. So this is at the end of his career. Right? He's already retired from Cornell. Who do you recognize? Anyway, Fred Rates is right here. Elizabeth Slater's right here. Some of you will recognize some of these people. That was 57. In 1925, Alan came and gave a program, one of our programs. Gotta wake up. He gave one of our programs, and he called it something like Our Vanishing Birds. 300 people show up for this talk. 300 people in 1925, and he shows photographs of, in Florida, along the St. Johns River, of ivory-billed woodpeckers that he had seen the year before. Yeah. But knew that it was a bird in decline. So, tell you a little bit about the programs we did then. That was our annual booklet. There's field trips and indoor programs. So you see there were indoor programs, talk on mushrooms, taught by a guy named Zoller, studying ornithology, botany, entomology. Not that different. I mean, this was it from the get-go. This is the inside of a booklet. Hike leaders, and people had their specialties. So there was a botanist named Baxter, birds and trees named Edson, etc. And then each hike was listed. But how did they get there? For hike number 1 for wild ducks, on April 26th, take the 2 p.m. Sea Breeze car to stop 18. Anybody want to take the Sea Breeze car? There it is. That's the Sea Breeze car. Because remember, we were in this time of trolleys, of electric trolleys, and it was quite the trolley system. Look at this map. I know it's hard to see it, but they went everywhere. And so you just got on the trolley, and the sad thing was it ended in 1930. But that's how people got to the sanctuary. There's the Bushnell's Basin Station. There's the electric trolley. So we went to Bushnell's, and then there were all these names that I didn't know, like, we're going to Ketchum's. Well, where's Ketchum? I didn't know where Ketchum was until last night, when I found this letter, thanks to Carol, I think, from, somewhere in our files, I don't know, from Miranda Wollston to Hoot in 1930, saying, I have some stuff for you, Mr. Hoot. If you just come down the Ketchum Road to where Fisher's Road comes off, so it would be like Route 96 now. Then it was Route 15. So there was Ketchum's. There are all these names. And here you see the electric trolley and the Auburn Railroad, that was the Auburn train, which was steam, which went down the railroad tracks that we were fighting for, right? So we had both. So, in honor of Marilyn Schindler, Louise Batesel was a founding member, and it turns out was a distant relative of Marilyn, who barely remembers her, but met her. And she lived in Bushnell's Basin. It was the most popular trip. As many as 175 people, think of that, went out there every year from the teens into the 40s. She even became on the board in the 40s, on the council. I think she never married, but she did this. And she traveled, and she lived out there. I guess they had owned a coal company, so she could do a lot of traveling, and she went everywhere. She gave a program about Palestine and the Mediterranean to bank, and Canadian Rockies and Alaska, and she went to South America and Europe. She went all over. She lived with her brother, and people loved her. Anyway, this is the earliest photo I have, other than that one of Hoot in 1922, and your mother is in this picture. I'm pretty sure that's her, looking at all the pictures I've seen of her, at age 10. So that was Amelia's daughter. That was our secretary's daughter. And this is out at Batesel's, because they would walk from Bushnell's Basin, and there's an esker near there that then wasn't forested. They would go to Lake Lacoma and Lily Pond. They would go over to what's now Powder Mills Park. They would go up to where Crescent Trail is, up Garnsey, and find these rare plants. I mean, it was amazing. It's so different. Hoot with binoculars. And then, hard to see, this guy with the beard. I'll show you more of him. His name is Fred Bowden. Look at this. This is 1926. Look how they're dressed. And this is going to be a field trip. Out at Batesels in Bushnell's Basin. Yeah, I mean, just fabulous pictures. And I love this one. So after the trolley stopped at Ketchum's, the next stop was Crossman Pond, which is the big pond. If you go down Fisher's Road and you turn, it's that big pond there on your left. It's called Crossman. If you keep going, the next stop is called Woods Crossing. I think it was right somewhere near Log Cabin Road. It didn't go exactly on Benson Road. It went off. But anyway, I love this photograph. It's just like this dirt road in the middle of there's a wetland, and that's like near where Bentley's Woods is. 1923. And there's that same guy with the beard you can't see, but he's got a little mushroom basket. That's a hint. Okay. This guy, he's got 4,000 pictures at the Eastman House. And he was an active bank member. His name was Charles Zoller. He had to be this really fun, great guy. Everybody, I mean, he was on the council. He was super involved in bank. Fabulous photographer. And bank at one time had a bunch of his pictures that were given to us. I can't find them. I don't know if they went up in flames in 1978 or what. But look, he had to be fun-loving. Look at that bike. Right? They had these high-wheelers in like the late 19th century. Okay. And here, on an Adirondack trip, he makes this pinhole camera and then takes a picture of himself. That's what that is. I love it. Through a pinhole is what it says on the photo. Yeah. Anyway, Hoot was born out in Sodus, near Zurich Bog. They called it Mud Pond then. Very popular place for field trips because it's so rich. Milton, I'll tell you about our beloved botanist, 40 species of orchids there. Amazing. And just to give you a sense of the time, this changed shortly after this. But here's our group. And you see what some of them have in their hands? Lady slippers. Yeah. Hate to tell you, but facts are facts. It changed. You wouldn't get any better conservationists anywhere than you found in Bank in those days. You would not. Another trip to Zurich Bog. And, there wasn't just botany, it wasn't just birds. There were people doing butterflies and moths. They were just looking at everything. And I love their picnic. I have a lot of pictures of them picnic lunches. And here they are at a place called Gola. Gola used to be a really cool place. It was a train stop out in Rush, right where Honeoye Creek comes into the Genesee River. Log Pond, really botanically rich. Fabulous area. Unusual plants, acres of mertensia, white trout lilies, as well as yellow trout lilies, unusual trilliums. Anyway, 1923. 1926 at Gola. And that's Zoller again. And here's Amelia. And my buddy Milton. And that's a vasculum. That's where you collect plants with. She was a botanist, Grace Carter. So here's from the program, and here's some of Amelia's notes. She saw song sparrow, kingbird, bluebird, spotted sandpiper, and oriole, pheasant, white dogtooth violet, dentaria, spring beauty, etc., etc. It's her field notes. It's great. Okay, this guy's name was August Seaback. This was 1923 at a place that Hoot named. It was this little ravine off Empire, well, it was now Empire there. Then they called it the Float Bridge, just past where the wetlands, Monroe County Park is. But you see what those flowers are? Can you tell? Those are lupins. We had acres and acres of lupins in these sandy soils. It's hard to find a wild lupin in Monroe County. There's a few around, but there were tons of them there. Anyway, and there may have been some unusual butterflies that we don't see associated with them. We don't know. But lots of lupins. And anyway, who called this glen? They walked up Tufa Glen. Tufa is like a freshwater limestone deposit, forms from calcareous springs. And I saw this picture. Oh my gosh, there it is. This is tufa. It just forms over lots of years from calcium carbonate precipitating out of groundwater that's full of dissolved lime. Where is this place? I found it Tufa Glen Road 20 years ago. Yeah, close to 20 years ago. I went, I didn't find any tufa. Now Google Earth comes along and I see, oh, it wasn't there. It was a little north of Tufa Glen Road. I went back last fall with a friend and look, I found that very rock. See? I was so excited. It's right there. And it looks like a little bit of Finger Lakes with a little waterfall, Tufa Glen. And let's look at these pictures. 40 Densmore Creek, that was a popular place. That's in Irondequoit. Look, they're putting down rocks to help people cross. Again, their clothing is a stitch. Your grandfather, the Kellers, I think, is in this picture. Maybe. I'm not sure if that's him. But here's Carl Heidweiler, Milton Baxter. Here's Hoot. Here's grandfather Heidweiler, I think. And here's Fred Boughton. Anyway, lots of people. Look what Amelia did. She made these lists. Okay, these are the trips in 1927. Every week. They went out every week. May 7th, 14th, 21st, 28th, etc. Every week. Wasn't once a month. Every week. Look at the numbers. 25, 70, 30, 31, 26, 100. 175 Bushnell's Basils. And does a trolley stop there? Yes or no? Yes, 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 yes. Okay? A few no's. Right? And then they might take the train. And so a lot of people did have cars. So, I mean, what a special. We got a lot of good press in those years. And they did these big trips. This guy, George Kellogg, said, let's go to the Adirondacks. I've been going there for years. There they go. Here's Will Heidweiler and Fred Boughton on top of, I forget. Anyway, and Amelia writes this amazing journal. Obviously, you can't read it. I just want to show you, like 8 pages typed every day, what they did, what they saw, who they met, etc., etc. So you have this amazing record from 1926 in Upper J. So they went to Lake Champlain, they climbed to Mount Ebenezer. They did a bunch of stuff. They collected X number of species of mushrooms, saw these birds. It's fabulous. So this guy, George Kellogg, he was the one who said, let's do it. He was a really interesting guy. It turns out he was an inventor, I found out by Googling him. And I found this patent that he did in 1904, and it was this pressure gauge in real ones. And then he went to work for Kodak and got really involved in photography. We had some pretty amazing people. I love this. Is one of my favorite pictures. That's him catching a fish. It's an action picture, right? In the Adirondacks. Yeah. And here's their mom, 12 years old, in a canoe, in a little rowboat in a beautiful serene lake in the Adirondacks. Amelia's daughter. Look at that trip. Isn't this amazing? Yeah. And here we are. Here's our crew. An old lumber camp, just great photos. And then 2 years later, they go to the Catskills to visit Hoot's place. You know, the ones I showed you. And again, Amelia writes this fabulous journal. And just in typical fashion, she puts an X. That's our room. This woman was amazing. Okay? And on the way, they stop by Cazenovia for lunch. But look, what I love about this picture, do you see this wind-up Victrola? Yeah, just fabulous. And it's all in her notes, too. So to have the pictures. And they climb. There they are on top of this mountain. This was a strenuous climb. And I look at this picture, and I think, first, I wasn't sure if this was the Adirondacks. Before Amelia's, in ours, it wasn't clear. In Lois's, I had seen this picture if it was the Adirondacks or the Catskills. And then I saw, look there. There. Buttons. I'm wearing one, thanks to the Kellers. I'm wearing one. They had just decided in 1926, in Amelia's minutes, we should have buttons. This is the first year you see the buttons. Okay? And here's your grandfather. You see your grandfather in the picture?
Yep.
Okay, that's him.
Probably
John Keller.
That's his button.
That's his button I got on. Could be, is right. There you are. Here's the button. Okay?
Is that the same button?
I think so. We won't know.
The logo we use now?
Yes, same logo. Yeah. Same logo, absolutely. And here we are at Slab Sides, 1926. That's not all. Kellogg says, let's visit the Tonawanda Reservation. I went out there, I made some contacts. This guy was pretty. And look how many people go. This is like astonishing when I see these pictures. 1924. You can't read this, but let me read it to you. It says, Indian Day, June 15th, 1924, dawned bright and clear. 17 autos, each labeled with a sign, Burroughs Audubon Nature Club, carrying about 80 members. Started from the corner of State and Main at 7:30 a.m. for Tonawanda Indian Reservation. The first stop was Caledonia Fish Hatchery, then Indian Falls, where we were joined by the Hobby Club of Batavia, under the leadership of Mr. and Miss Marble, then on through the Indian Reservation, Mr. Kellogg pointing out many places of interest. Basket dinner at Moses Grove, church service somewhere at Little Methodist Chapel, where several hymns were sung in Seneca dialect. Wow is right. The Longhouse of the Indians was opened especially for us. Many photographs, including motion pictures, were taken. Beautiful Indian baskets were exhibited and sold. We were everywhere most cordially received and invited to return and finish the wonderful day with supper on the wooded shore of Divers Lake. We wouldn't know this if it was not that we have Amelia's 1924 typed notes. I can't emphasize how important for history it is to keep good records. I mean, this is just incredible. Look at that. 103-year-old Indian woman in whose book said she had recently taken a plane ride. And here's the Divers Lake that they ended the day, and there's Mary Kate, and that's Marguerite, I think. Her older sister, Amelia's two girls. And they went to Niagara Glen as an overnight. And they did all this stuff. And they did all the parks. And here's Highland Park in 1928. This is from our book. Not many people, but look at that. Did any of you remember that? Children's Pavilion. Designed by Olmsted, supposed to be the centerpiece of Highland Park, taken down in the 60s. Yeah. They went out to Leroy, where we're going next week. I'm leading a group to the Gulf, right by there. And they would have lunch under the bridge by the falls. And they're going to the Gulf, where I'm taking some of you next week. Fabulous wildflower area with these weird trilliums. And this is what Amelia says in 1930. The majority, desiring to clamber over the rocks with Mr. Baxter, crawled along a narrow ledge, halfway down the steep side, and were well rewarded by finding the rarest of ferns, walking fern, purple stem cliffbrake, and others. And of particular interest was the rock formation, a great assortment of freak trilliums, that's what I showed you the picture of, and the ovenbird nest, which we fortunately did not step upon.
They're on the ground, ovenbird?
Yes, they nest on the ground. So, who is this Mr. Baxter? This Mr. Baxter is how I got into all this. It wasn't bank. I've been working in the herbarium studying sedges, and I'm finding this Milton Baxter guy has responsible, I've looked at 2,500 sedges, 1,400 collections were from him. Okay? 55%. And this is true for all the plants in there, not just the sedges. So who is this guy? And then I find out, when I'm researching him, that he was a member of Bank. I find that out in his obituary. And then I say it to Jerry, and he says, oh yeah, we have a picture of him. Turned out he was on the council, and everybody loved him. He was really, I guess, really soft-spoken, super careful botanist, really knowledgeable. Really amazing guy who worked for the Rochester Telephone Company for 50 years. I mean, you think about the stories of each of these people. 1879 he started, so this was April 20, 1929. He moved, he was born in like a log cabin, it says, Adams Basin, moved to Rochester, was one of 3 people working for Rochester Telephone. The whole subscriber list was like 25 people in 1879. But it quickly grew, so they hired, it was just like 3 guys. They quickly hired girls, that's what it says in the article. And then Milton was promoted. In fact, they sent him to set up the phone system in Switzerland, then in Riga, and then St. Petersburg, Petrograd. And he was there for 10 years. And you look in the Rochester Herbarium, there are these collections from Russia from him. So he comes back in 1891 with a wife and a little baby. And that baby grew up, and there were field trips at her place out in Naples. But anyway, Milton was an amazing guy. And I bring him up now because at a council meeting in 1925, he said, we have a lot of field trips out that Fisher's Way, and why don't we think about looking for a place to call our own, some property. So they liked the idea and made his contacts, and they found the farm, which was like right in the middle of, they went all over, but that was right in the middle of one of the main places they went, because it was so rich. Here he is in Virgin Swamp. Anybody tell what he's got? A rattlesnake. This was on a bank field trip, and that's Will Heidweiler behind him. And listen to this, this is a different secretary. I think Amelia might not have gone, but this is a different secretary filling in. She says, a genuine virgin rattlesnake found under a log by Miss Follett. With Mr. Baxter as an impromptu snake charmer, the snake literally coiled about his stick, much to the amusement and education of the half-frightened, all-thrilled onlookers. And they went out with some people from Buffalo. Finally, a Buffalo entomologist, Mr. Wild, of the Buffalo Museum to be exact, with the bravery befitting any knight, got his fingers about the back of the snake's head, and with the help of Carl Heidweiler, appeared not too delighted with his task, but ultimately got him in a bag. But all this was for naught, as Mr. Wild tearfully released the snake after hearing a conservation sermon by Messrs. Baxter and Messerschmitt. Love this stuff. Love this stuff. Yeah. So I couldn't just do a program on Baxter because you'd obviously, real fast, you'd see lots of sheets of plants with labels. But I did want to show you, because this is the herbarium, and here he names it, when he collected it, and where at Seabreeze. I mean, it's fabulous stuff. And it's really important stuff. The herbarium belongs to the Rochester Academy of Science, and it's housed in the Rochester Museum and Science Center right now. It's had several homes. It was at the U of R, it was at the Parks Department, and now it's at the museum. Milton and others, remember I mentioned this close collaboration between the museum and bank? Well, for decades, they worked very closely. They had a nature room. They got along really well with the president of the museum. And they had a publication, which somebody gave me a copy of tonight, one of the Kellers, called, it was George, called Science, I forget what they called it, Science something. But Milton wrote several articles, Amelia wrote articles, their dad wrote articles, and many other members. We have like 25 different articles over like 20 years in this museum publication that got mailed out, I think, quarterly. And now it's all bound in their library. But anyway, this one he wrote in 1938, shortly before he died, called Vanishing Wildflowers. And it's kind of sad, but it's they were really aware of the changes to the environment and declining plants. And not just plants, but he gave good examples, because we have a herbarium, we know that. So he brought out, why don't we get a place of our own, and this is the one here's that hickory tree. Shagbark, and there's the farm. And there it is from the other side. And here's the purchase offer, 1925. Deposit $200. Purchase price to be $4,000. We agree to assume the present mortgage, and we'll pay $2,000 down. How are they going to get $2,000 in 1927? By pledges. And did they get pledges? Who writes this? He writes a thing in the annual booklet. You can't read it, but it says, the farm is ours for $4,000. We need money. We need help. And help they got. And I got like 5 pages of this printed out, how much they pledged and how much they paid. And everybody paid up. And a lot of high wilders. And this is only one of 5 pages. People paid as little as $1. People paid as much as $200. But so many people contributed to get that. And all the names that you've been hearing about, and then I feel like I know these people, even though they're older than my grandparents. Anyway. So, of course, and everything's in the DNC. I mean, it was so different. Nature Club buys farm as country home, December 27. April 27, they closed April 1st, 27. And here they are planting, I think, those spruce trees. You know that spruce grove we have that's still mostly alive? As you go down, I don't remember, the trail sort of going straight back along the hillside. Woodland Trail. Yeah, and they're planting those trees. And there's Mary Kate, and there's Hoot, and here's a spruce tree right here. Right? These are those trees when they were planted. And tree planting has always been part of Bank. And this amazing dedication day. I wish we had secretary notes to go with this. 200 people. I mean, this was a big deal. This was a really big deal. And quite a day it was, by all accounts, and even bagpipers, because one of the members was a bagpiper. Music was a big part of Bank, a big part. And there's Mary Kay, and they do this procession down to the creek, and then they dance on the green, they say. I mean, they were so excited. But imagine, and this was dedication, this was the 87, so 50... What was 87? 60-year celebration of the purchase. Have bagpipers. And we're going to have a bagpiper this year, I think. Is that right, Julie?
What's that?
Yes.
Thank you.
What?
Bagpipers.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes, for sure.
Okay.
We will.
So, there was a bridge. Remember how, we own some land on the other side, but who goes there? Well, they used to go there until it got washed out. And then they built it again, and then it would get washed out, and now we're in a period of being washed out, where we've been for a long time. But anyway, through the orchard, across Low Water Bridge, that's sort of a play on words. The guy, we did have a member named Low Water. He was the official photographer, one of 3. But it only was good at low water, and high water would get washed out. And anyway, so they kept rebuilding the bridge. But, they made cards, they, colorized, wrote poems. I mean, this was quite the thing. They had postcards of it, you name it. And here it is on their map, showing how to get there. Remember, the trolley only went for 3 years. But here's Route 15, which is now 96. Railroad Mills Road wasn't there, but the railroad was there. So, old pictures. Notice that chimney. That chimney was added on. I don't know if you noticed the earlier picture. There was nothing on that side. They put in a fireplace. They put in a chimney. It was one of the first things. Amelia says this was the busiest time in the history of the club, and it may be true even since. There were quilting bees. They were raising money every which way. They would do wallpapering. They put down rugs. They put in furniture. I guess it was a little smelly. You name it. I mean, they were trying to take this old farmhouse that was already 100 years old and make it a nice station. And it was a labor of love for lots and lots of people. One of the outbuildings that's gone. I love this picture. They took down the barn, they took down the outbuildings, and you can see the remains of them there. Way in the distance is the railroad. You might just be able to see the sign. So this is where the old barn was. It's like Audubon Lane. That's Messerschmitt, I'm pretty sure. who was the next president. Here they're moving, they call it the ladies' room, up from like the railroad down to bank. I mean, they were having fun. So, there you go.
Is that the building that burned?
A lot of buildings burned. Yeah, there were several fires. Oh, you mean our building? Yes, that was our clubhouse. Right.
That old farmhouse?
Yeah. Yeah. So here you see more tree planting. See, Arbor Day, 1937. I mean, it just was forever. They were planting trees. Here it is, 1937, more trees.
Note the date.
Note the date. Now look at these trees are no longer alive. These were planted 1929, and that one was, 1927. She was our first vice president. Those are the dead larch. We have some dead larch near Keller's Knoll, dead red pine. They're still standing, some of them, but they didn't live that long. You know, maybe the other trees would have been better, but they were planting trees. They were trying to make it a nice place. And here, and I think this was in honor of Elizabeth Slater planting a hackberry, so this would have been like 70 years ago. I think that hackberry may not be our biggest one. I think it's maybe one of the smaller ones. And I believe it was in memory of Amelia, the secretary, their grandmother, who it says in something we have that a hackberry was planted in her honor. And they used to do that a lot. And Carl, who was your uncle, right? The uncle, who a lot of, some of you old-timers would remember, died in 1979 and became a member in 1922. So we're talking about a long devoted history. And he did so much work. He was on council, he worked the grounds, he led walks, he was banked through and through. He lived there in the summer. A lot of people would spend weekends or longer. A lot of good memories. Somebody who couldn't make the meeting lives in Virginia. Dana Spencer tells me great memories he has of being out there for summers in the 50s with Carl. People would spend the nights or longer, weeks. So, all was not always nice, as in any organization, right? So conflicts appeared. So who, like I said, I think he had a strong personality. I think maybe some people got rubbed the wrong way. I don't know what happened. It's hard to read exactly between the lines. But what I can tell you is in 1930, he was re-elected president, but it was contested. Usually elections are not contested. It was contested. They had nominated Edson, who got nominated by the floor. He won, and his slate of council won. And then he says, a week later, he writes to Amelia Heidweiler, "It will be impossible for me to sit in council with persons who have manifested such a bitter feeling towards me. Neither can I think of ever again trying to conduct meetings and maintain harmony in an atmosphere of opposition and dissension." And then he goes on to say, "I want you to know that my every act has been unselfish, honest, and for the benefit of all concerned." And I think that's true. Who knows what the conflict was, but there was conflict. So he resigned. William Edson became president for 2 years. And Hood sort of backed off. And there was a period of a couple of years where there are some letters that are not very nice, but then he came back. So, I mean, this is just what happens. And I found this in something that Carol gave me. It's like, what is this? This was all by itself. It wasn't in the album. It was just in an envelope. And it was like, oh, so this tells you there are some feelings here. The Edsonic, this guy's name was William Edson, who took over. The Edsonic eclipse of the Botanic domination, residential desertion. So we can laugh about it. It's 80 years later. We're not hurting anybody's feelings, but, stuff was happening. Anyway, so this is the guy who came. He was a founding member. He became the next president. It turns out he wrote a bird column for the DNC from 1934 till 1962, keeping track of all the birds. So he was sort of like the bird guy in Rochester. But he was a botanist. He was a horticulturalist. He worked at Highland Park for his job. Because he met his wife on a bank outing. They got married in 1924. Anyway, 2 years later, 1 year later, they burned the mortgage. They had a $2,000 mortgage. They paid $500 a year for 4 years, and it was done. That was a big deal. So, I mean, there's so much. They needed to get a permanent charter. You know, we are actually a nonprofit educational corporation chartered by the state of New York. That doesn't just happen. So they had to apply. They got a provisional charter in 1927 and got a permanent charter 5 years. And here they're saying, you see, we're real. We've got 289 ferns and flowers and 100 trees and shrubs and 43 butterflies. And we're doing all this education and field trips, and this many people are coming. So they're making their case. This was not common. There were not other clubs doing this kind of thing. In the whole country, there were very few. So they got it, and that was big. And here they're writing their annual report. And I've highlighted this. They're talking about their work with young people, and they say, Miss Marguerite Heidweiler, so this is their aunt. People at the table here, their aunt is a graduate of the University of Rochester, done work at Cornell, and is spending the summer at Hudson Bay in Canada. She spent 6 weeks up in Churchill in 1932. She actually was like the second woman to get her PhD at Cornell, period, in the whole country. Her sister, Mary Kay, that you saw pictures of, has had 3 years of at Cornell and is showing ability, and she also became an ornithologist. Homer Jack is studying. So these were three young people, and they say they wouldn't have done this if it wasn't for the influence of Bank. Through their parents, the influence of Bank. And I think that's probably true. So education was always a big part. So they were always having celebrations like we do, right? So in 1933, in celebration of the 20th anniversary, people from Buffalo, etc. came, but due to a misunderstanding, the reception committee with Mrs. Horace Pierce and Mr. Baxter was unfortunately left standing all morning at Pittsburgh, thus depriving the company of his valuable services. So, yeah, so you know, it was, if you didn't have a car, and there was no more trolley, but this was the big spread from that 20th anniversary day in the DNC. And there's Edson, and she was one of the founders, and here's another one of those bridges. Yeah, and this says Stone photo. You know, Stone did a lot of old Rochester photos. So Burroughs was an important place. I want to tell you a little bit about conservation. We were not only education and protection. I mean, this was way before, you know, Rachel Carson, before the modern environmental movement. And here they're at Sodus Bay, and they're looking at these lotuses. This is what a lotus flower looks like. This was the only place it was known in New York. It was thought to be native. And Amelia writes letters to legislators, gets lots of other people too, and gets it on a protected list. Protection asks for lotus lilies in the paper, and she gets a Western Union. I had to put this in. Lotus bill just passed Assembly and now goes to Senate, signed by her legislator. I love it. Western Union, 1931. And here's a letter from the head of the State Museum. Congratulations, Ms. Heidweiler. The lotus is now protected. I shouldn't tell you, but the sad news, it's not there. It's gone. So, mushrooms. This is Fred Boughton, the mushroom man. Mr. Boughton is an authority on mushrooms and had prepared a talk, etc. We gathered and picked about a half a peck, and here's some honey mushroom out on the bench. And this has been a tradition. So Boughton was the inspiration for others. So here he is talking to people. And some of you may know Steve Thomas. He used to be the director of the Rochester Museum. That his name was Buzzy Al Buzzowitz, who was part of Bang, very active for not that long a time, because he ended up going to Massachusetts, and Raymond Call, who was a president. And here's Leo Tangi, who taught the mushroom class that I took, and I took over after him. in around the late 50s with young kids and mushrooms on a bank outing. So it just sort of gets passed on. Fred Bowden gave Leo some of his books. Leo passed on some of his books to me. I have some books of Fred Bowden. I didn't even know. This was long before a bank. And there's Leo. I think I was in that class. We're having Shaggy Man's soup at bank. Anyway, 1936 booklet. I think I'm going on pretty long, so I'm going to go a little quicker. I just want to show you. All right. I had Philly. We're only to 1932. Okay. Halloween masquerade. There's a few things you should know. Like, they had this Halloween party. They started in 1930 for years, and people would dress up, and there was always music. That's why Julie started with music this year. It says, Mr. Sistar entertained with 3 zither numbers. Miss Sheely, who was a member from the 20s, and she died in 1979, and eventually married Carl Heidweiler. I spelled her name wrong. And Mr. Bowden played the piano. There were always music. We did stunts and dance, and we had a grand time. Okay? Cool stuff. This is 1946, and this is Bob McKinney. Some of you may recognize. 1946 at Halloween at Tay House. Tay House. So, 50 years of conservation. There's lots of music. There's violins. Conservation Virgin Swamp. Bank was involved in Virgin Swamp. So, always working on the house. And here they shingled it. Remember the white clapboard? 1936 they shingled it. Doesn't it look beautiful? Yeah. And field trips everywhere. Letchworth in 1935. Chimney Bluffs in the 30s. Here they are on Canandaigua Lake in the 30s. Milton's in the picture. Amelia's in it. And I have to tell you, Amelia writes a book. In 1938, we have copies here not for sale, but we have some copies to see of all these fabulous field trip places, some of which are still around, and some are gone.
Yes, this was an amazing record of the field trip places. For example, she covered all the city and county parks that were popular places for our trips, places like Highland, Seneca, Durant, Mendon, Powder Mills, these fabulous sites along Irondequoit Bay, which was another popular place. Remember, the trolley had all those stops around there. A place called Float Bridge, Tufa Glen, Inspiration Point, which unfortunately is now private with the big homes there, but was a fabulous botany place, an overlook of the bay. All the areas around our sanctuary, a place called Sullivan's Woods, or Sullivan's, which is now Bentley's Woods, which the Nature Conservancy owns. She included Virgin and Zurich bogs, West Rush Woods, all these places. I mean, this book was the best record of the natural areas that existed in the Rochester area. It's really a treasure to have. And that's not all. Look at this quote. This is how she ends the book. Look at this conservation ethic that Amelia and Banks shared. Thus, it is the duty of every person who loves the outdoors to take an active interest in conservation problems and thereby act to preserve the remnants of wildlife for future enjoyment as well as for scientific value. I mean, it doesn't get any better. That is the conservation ethic long before the conservation movement. And that was Amelia's quote. Okay, I'm going to show you some of the other people who were important in Bank at that time. This fellow named Carlton Brooks, he was an active member. I believe he was on the council. And he worked at the museum for years. Remember, the Museum of Bank had a very close association. And he was a taxidermist and was responsible for many of their displays, some of which are still there. He lived out in Marion, Palmyra area, Marion, and there were field trips to the Brooks farm, which was a fabulous place. And then, in the late 30s, 1938, they celebrated their 25th anniversary. This was a big deal. It was at the Culver Armory. And what an elaborate event this was. The whole program was done in silver. It was designed by one of the members, Alexander Jack, who was a graphic artist. notice who's on the cover, John Burroughs and Audubon. The table decorations, Mary, were just unbelievable. Silver cones, very, very elaborate. There was a toastmaster who was Milton's son-in-law, a very colorful man named Kenneth Shedd, who used to teach at the U of R until he was fired for his socialist perspective in the early teens, believe it or not. Anyway, he was Milton's son-in-law. He was the toastmaster and song leader. They recognized 16 of the founders, the honorary members, Fred Boughton and Milton Baxter, the two honorary members. I guess also who was. What an event. And the person who came and gave the keynote that night was the director of the New York State Museum in Albany. His name was Charles Adams. And listen to the topic, the value of outdoor study of nature. I mean, this was quite a celebration. And we were all thrilled tonight to have 80 people. It was one of the biggest attendances we've had for years. Do you know how many people they had in the 25th in 1938? 289. It was amazing. So this was that bank's heyday in many ways. Focus on conservation, preservation, and education. And speaking of education, this was the overview. Got a little ahead of myself. Speaking of education, look at this. Anybody recognize the young man in that picture? That's Alan Klonick. Alan, when he graduated high school, graduated Monroe High School in 1938. Alan was a member for many, many decades, just passed away a few years ago. Very active, but he was nurtured. Ben nurtured young people. So here he graduated Monroe High School and was given a scholarship for 6 weeks to study at the Allegheny Nature School, along with this young woman, Caroline Brewer. And so Bank did this. They nurtured young people's interest in nature study and conservation. And for Alan, it was a lifelong, he was active in birding organizations and Bank as a lifelong activity. And here you see, around the same time, maybe a little later, here's Alan on the right, or second from the right, along with Amelia Heidweiler in the center, and the Jacks, Alexander and Mrs. Jack on the left side, and the woman whose hand is up second from the left, her name is Florence Zinsmeister, and she taught many of the programs at the Nature Camp. What Nature Camp? Well, we had a nature camp here for 5 or 6 years called the Baxter Trail Camp, named after Milton. And kids came, teenagers. There was also one for adults. And they spent a week at the sanctuary. They lived in the farmhouse. And we have the journals of the instructor, Florence Zinsmeister. It was fabulous. And then there was a week of that, and then there was a week of the adult camp. And the museum also brought kids out for a few years around that time. And these are some pictures from the museum's trail camp at Burroughs, at Bank. And look at all the kids, they're studying, and they have nets, and you might even recognize some of the trails that they're on. This was, and there's Irondequoit Creek. So Bank was really part of nurturing the next generation. And I just love seeing these pictures of young people. And, into the 40s, now those were the war years, so everything changed. But Bank stayed busy. Not as busy, but busy, and they did field trips. And I just love this one from the Democratic Chronicle on the lower, because it shows some Bank people at the top with their collecting vasculums for plants. One of the presidents, Cooper, Florence Zinsmeister, and then on the bottom, it says, with a magnifying glass, Clickanoy, who's actually the guy there on the left, helps pretty Miss Ford identify viburnum bush. Pretty Miss Ford. You wouldn't see that in today's Democratic Chronicle. Anyway, 1942, field day at Bank with a botany contest. We had a botany log. I'll show you a little bit about that later. And remember, Amelia was secretary for like 19 years. And then the woman who took over wrote a book, and her name was Hattie Kofod in the early 40s. And her book was called Home in the Woods, and it was about Tufa Glen. Remember I showed you that picture about Tufa Glen? It was published. We have a couple of copies of it, and who wrote the foreword. So this was one active group, even in the war years. And the war years, you know, everything changed, as you all know. And look at the booklet in 1944. They honor some of our members, Lieutenant Alan Klonick and Lieutenant John Keller Jr., who was an active member also, and the son of the Kellers who are here tonight, being recognized in the annual booklet. It was probably because of the war that after 6 years or so, trail camp didn't continue, because there was just, everything was more difficult. So anyway, and here's Mr. Keller, the grandfather of the folks who are here tonight. An article in 1944 retiring as his work as a mailman, but it mentions that he's a member of the bank, nature lover, and he's going to continue walking and looking at plants. So the Kellers go way back, and we're so happy to have them here tonight. And of course, you all know that we have a Keller's Knoll. And at one time, there were picnic tables on it. And you can see our clubhouse in the background, and the shagbark hickory right at Keller's Knoll, along the creek, right at one of the bends in the creek. So that's Keller's Knoll. And here, I love this picture because this is Amelia and Will Heidweiler. And Amelia is showing her scrapbook, this fabulous scrapbook that Carol donated to the club, and which has provided many of the photos for this talk. And they're out of bank field trip at Mendon Pond. I think it was 1946. She had just completed it, and she was showing the folks who were there some of the pictures, and I recognize those very pictures. And what a treasure that she did this. And as I mentioned earlier, sadly, she died just a few years later, tragically injured, fatally injured in a car accident near her cottage along the lakeshore. But we have this scrapbook, and her memory and her efforts have made a huge impact for our understanding of Banks history. So, and then here, after the war, stuff picked up again, and we're back in 1948, and you see the two young children on the left side, and they're here tonight, grown up. That's Dirk and Carol, and their mom and dad are in the picture. Their mom is third from the right in the second row, and the dad third from the left in the second row, and their dad is second from the left in the back row. You know, good collaboration with the museum. I know Nancy said, I think it was Nancy saying, oh, I remember those meetings. He would do the bird report and go on and on and on. So it wasn't for everybody. He's doing his bird report here. But look, and then they revived junior camp in the early 50s, and this was their dad. This was Dirk and Carol's dad right here, and mom right here. That's Amelia's daughter, grown up, and her father, and her son-in-law. And that's the Moons. Some of you know them. Anyway, yeah. So Dirk Sr., their dad, and Al Busowitz, junior camp. And there's Dirk in 1990 on Earth Day, planting a chestnut tree he grew from seed. And Al, this guy, in 1982, coming back from Massachusetts, where he was the director of a Mass Audubon sanctuary for decades, to do a program, Winter Trees or something. And here's the whole family who's here tonight. These four, these three are here. Yeah. And Mary Kate passed away a few years ago, and Dirk also. And these must be your kids, right?
That name is Mary.
And this is Mary Kate in 1924. So this and this are the same person. And, yeah. Anyway, I just love seeing pictures of them with kids, doing stuff with kids. So I'm going to go really quickly. They always had songs. So here's Joanna Call leading they had songbooks, leading a singing thing at a big banquet. And they had auctions. This guy, Henry Rohr, was auctioning something in the 50s. He was a member from the 20s.
Bob McKinney auctioning a pie in the 50s. And Bob McKinney banding birds at the sanctuary in the 60s. It's too bad he's not here to see it. But, yeah. They did this botany log where they took this big log, they drill holes, put in test tube, something like a test tube filled with water and stuck plants in, and then they had these little contests. Can you identify this and that? They taught botany. They also did these classes for adults. And it's just really something. And that's Alan and one of his sons, 60s, and just other field trips. I really wanted to focus on the early days, but they're looking at an eclipse here. See the crescent? Leo, Elvis Shealy, Carl Heidweiler, Oak Orchard. That's Myers. I think they're at Allegheny. Bank was one of the founders of the pilgrimage, starting in 1960 above Hemlock Lake. So, it just continues. Back to slab sides. And there's Lois. I had to put this in. 1972 or 3. Yeah. And I wanted to show you the inside of the house. You didn't see it. This herbarium, they had collections of over 400 species from the grounds. All gone. But not just, the herbarium breaks my heart, but the whole thing is heartbreaking. The whole thing. Look at the inside. Look at this. Look at this. You name it. And I don't know, when I look at that thing there, that looks like a great auk. I don't know how Bank would ever come on a great auk, but that's what it looks like. But anyway, there's the shovel. There's that shovel from Burroughs, from the dedication. Isn't that beautiful? What a comfortable, homey place. Yeah, very, very sad. So this was Reg giving a history. That's Carl in there. That's Becky and Lois and Marilyn and Reg. And then we had this crazy arson, right? 1978, September. Arson. Yeah. Arson. Yeah. And, all I can say is a couple of years later, we're, rebuilding, right? This is the group. This is the new construction. You can see some of the cinder blocks. And these people, a lot of people were involved, but these people stand out. Some of the people involved, Reg and Monroe and Ione. But lots and lots of people were involved. I can't cover everybody. And just to see, it goes on. That's Joanne and Jennifer in the middle, collecting fossils in the 80s. And that's Bob McKinney, and I don't know who that guy is with the blue hat. Looks a little familiar. And, yeah, it is. Anyway, there you go. Happy 100th. And this was a quote from Hoot. May its days never end and its good work continue as the years onward roll. And there you are. I know I kept you a little longer, but it's